Bobby Lee Claremont and the Criminal Element by Jeannie Mobley. Author's note. In 1970, Steve Goodman immortalized the Illinois Central's passengers train that ran between Chicago and New Orleans with his song The City of New Orleans, a tune that has repeatedly climbed the charts in the performances of Arlo Guthrie, Willie Nelson, and Johnny Cash. While the train they call the City of New Orleans did not make her debut on the line until 1947, the Illinois Central Railroad between New Orleans and Chicago dates back to 1856, when it was the longest rail line in the world. Over the decades, it carried hundreds of thousands of people and millions of dollars worth of freight through the heartland of America. In the early decades of the 20th century, it was a major avenue of the Great Migration, as African Americans moved north to industrial cities like Chicago, pulled by the promise of jobs and pushed by the injustice of segregation under the Jim Crow laws. New Orleans was hit hard by the relatively late adoption of Jim Crow laws. The city had a long history of intermixing, dating back to its French origins. Significant segregation began only after 1890, when Louisiana passed its first Jim Crow law, a full 10 to 20 years after most other southern states. The 1890 law called for segregation on rail cars, and the challenge that the New Orleans black community put forward to that law was one of the most famous and disastrous landmarks of civil rights history. Homer Plessy, a French-speaking Creole who was one-eighth black, or octoroon, in the language of the era, deliberately passed as a white man and rode in a white rail car, setting up his prearranged arrest. The plan was to show the arbitrary nature of the law of the land, a man who looked white and was 7/8 white being categorized as black, and to pose a legal challenge to segregation. However, when, in 1896, the United States Supreme Court upheld separate but equal in Plessy v. Ferguson, Jim Crow laws were given a green light to flourish throughout the South. The verdict was not overturned until 1967, 3 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made segregation illegal throughout America. In New Orleans, segregation meant the members of a long-established middle-class Creole community, many of them educated in first-rate white schools and colleges, suddenly found themselves redefined as black and categorized with the poorer African American community. The face of the city and its music were changed dramatically. Many historians see this as a pivotal element in the birth of jazz, as classically trained Creole musicians intermingled with African American folk musicians. While the South was pulling itself apart along colored lines, Chicago was struggling with increased ethnic tension over prohibition and the control of illegal alcohol. In the early 1920s, Al Capone was not the only powerful mobster making the streets of the city dangerous. Dean O'Banion, an unimposing florist and ruthless leader of the primarily Irish-American North Side Gang, was battling the Italian-American Johnny Torrio and Al Capone for supremacy in the bootleg business. O'Banion's murder by his rivals in 1924, the flowers at the funeral were reportedly spectacular, sparked the bloody gang war that culminated in the infamous Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. This might appease any readers who felt Kelly and O'Banion didn't quite get their comeuppance in my story set in 1923. By now, perhaps, you will see many of the threads of history I have tried to pull together in my story. Drawing inspiration from Homer Plessy's courageous act of civil disobedience, I have attempted to show the senseless and arbitrary nature of race law in early 20th century America, and the hardships it created for the people in New Orleans, most especially its African American and mixed-race populations. And like Homer Plessy, I have chosen to do it by putting an octoroon on a segregated train, a setting which allowed me to explore the way the rules and even the definition of who was white changed on a 23-hour journey north. To flesh out the details of that journey, I used an original early 20th century timetable to create the stops and times in each chapter, and a variety of historic photographs, postcards, and oral histories to accurately recreate those stops and the activities that occurred at them. One of the most wonderful resources I found was the website Fulton KY's Historic African American Railroaders, filled with images and oral histories of African Americans who worked for the Illinois Central Railroad at http://FultonKYS African American Railroaders, weebly.com/railroad/man.html. I also relied on the internet and a few French Canadian friends to help me with the expressions and the spelling differences of Cajun French, a dialect descended from the Acadian French of Canada. But for me, this story all started with Steve Goodman's City of New Orleans. The idea came to me in the shower one morning. Yes, I sing in the shower. After the song had been stuck in my head for about a week, I thought about the lovely images of ordinary people contained within it, and wondered what the backstory of those people might be. And so, if you read my story carefully, you will see my nods to many of the details Mr. Goodman recorded on the southbound Odyssey, scattered throughout my northbound stories set 50 years earlier.